Imagine stepping into an ancient forest where towering oaks stretch their gnarled branches toward a sky veiled in mist. The air hums with secrets, whispers of a time long forgotten, when shadowy figures moved between the trees, guardians of knowledge, masters of nature's hidden forces. These were the Druids, enigmatic priests and scholars who wielded influence far beyond their woodland sanctuaries, shaping the fate of medieval Europe in ways history has only begun to reveal. Their story is one of power, mystery, and rituals so profound they echo through the centuries, yet so carefully guarded that much of their truth remains buried beneath layers of myth and legend. What if I told you that the Druids were far more than the robed figures of folklore? That their influence seeped into the very foundations of kingdoms, their wisdom secretly woven into the fabric of societies that rose long after their time. From the sacred groves of Celtic lands to the shadowed halls of medieval rulers, the Druids left traces of their legacy, clues hidden in stone circles, whispered in old tales, even encoded in the rituals of later civilizations. They were advisors to kings, keepers of cosmic secrets, and perhaps even the unseen architects of traditions we still recognize today. This is the untold story of the Druids, not as distant myths, but as pivotal players in a history far richer and more complex than we've been led to believe. Over the course of this journey, we'll peel back the layers of time to uncover their true role in shaping the medieval world. How did their rituals influence the rise of powerful dynasties? What lost knowledge did they protect, and why was it so fiercely guarded? And perhaps most tantalizing of all, what fragments of their wisdom might still linger, waiting to be rediscovered? The answers lie ahead, hidden in the mist of centuries, ready to be brought into the light. The first whispers of the Druids reach us through the ink-stained pages of ancient conquerors and scholars. When Julius Caesar marched into Gaul in the 1st century before the Common Era, he recorded encounters with robed figures who held sway over tribes far beyond the reach of Roman law. In his Gallic Wars, he describes them not as mere priests, but as judges, teachers, and arbiters of life and death, men who could halt battles with a single word, and who spent decades memorizing sacred verses too potent to be written down. But Caesar's account raises more questions than it answers. Were these Druids the product of a sudden religious movement, or had their roots sunk deep into the soil of Europe long before Rome's legions arrived? Archaeology offers tantalizing clues. Ancient burial sites and artifacts scattered across modern-day France, Britain, and Ireland suggest that Proto-Celtic tribes as early as the late Bronze Age practiced rituals aligned with later Druidic traditions. Offerings placed in sacred springs, ceremonial cauldrons buried with chieftains, even tree trunks carved with faces that seem to watch from between worlds. These fragments hint at a spiritual lineage stretching back centuries before written history, a gradual crystallization of beliefs that would eventually place the Druids at the heart of Iron Age societies. By the time Greek explorer Pytheas penned his lost travels in the 4th century before the Common Era, Druids were already renowned as philosophers whose knowledge of astronomy and nature rivaled that of Athens' greatest minds. Yet the very sources that preserve their memory also distort it. Roman writers like Pliny the Elder painted them as mystical figures harvesting mistletoe with golden sickles, while later Christian chroniclers dismissed them as pagan sorcerers. Stripping away these layers of bias reveals something far more compelling. A scholarly class who mediated between tribes, preserved oral histories, and perhaps even influenced the structure of early Celtic law. Their power didn't come from swords or crowns, but from something far more enduring: the ability to weave together the sacred and the practical, to balance the rhythms of the stars with the needs of the earth. What's most striking isn't just their role, but their reach. From the oak groves of Gaul to the stone circles of Britain, Druidic networks seem to have transcended tribal boundaries, forming a loose but powerful web of knowledge sharing that Rome saw as a threat. When the Empire finally crushed their stronghold on the island of Anglesey in 61 of the Common Era, they weren't just destroying a priesthood, they were erasing a living library of songs, laws, and celestial observations that had guided generations. Yet, as we'll soon discover, the Druids' disappearance was only the beginning of their hidden legacy. To understand the true influence of the Druids, we must look beyond their mystical reputation and into the meticulous structure that made them the backbone of Celtic society. At the pinnacle stood the Archdruid, a figure of immense authority chosen not by birthright but through decades of study and spiritual mastery. Clad in white robes symbolizing purity and wisdom, they presided over the grandest rituals, solstice ceremonies at Stonehenge, royal inaugurations, and the rare, dreaded judgments that could banish even kings from their tribes. Beneath them moved the Druids proper, scholars who specialized in law, astronomy, or medicine, their knowledge passed down through generations in a tradition so rigorous that memorizing a single sacred text could take 20 years. Then came the Ovates, the seers and healers who walked the line between worlds. Where Druids interpreted the laws of men and gods, Ovates read the whispers of nature itself. They studied the flight patterns of birds, the entrails of sacrificial animals, the shifting patterns of mist over sacred groves. Their role wasn't just prophecy but mediation. An Ovate might determine the perfect day for planting crops or counsel a chieftain on whether to wage war based on the murmurs of the wind. Completing this triad were the Bards, the living libraries of their people. Through epic poems and intricate songs, they preserved histories, genealogies, and even land boundaries with hypnotic precision. A bard's memory was his weapon. Losing a single verse could mean erasing a century of tradition. Their training was brutal. Apprentices spent years in darkness to sharpen their hearing, composing verses so complex that modern linguists still puzzle over their meter. Yet their power was undeniable. A well-delivered satire could ruin a leader's reputation, while a praise song might secure alliances between warring clans. This hierarchy wasn't just spiritual, it was political. Druids settled disputes between tribes with judgments so respected that even Rome's chroniclers admitted their fairness. Their schools, often hidden in dense forests or on remote islands, attracted noble sons from across Europe, binding diverse cultures through shared knowledge. And when conflict loomed, it was the Druids who negotiated peace, their neutrality protected by a code that forbade them from bearing arms. What emerges isn't a band of shadowy mystics, but a sophisticated intellectual class whose influence stretched from the battlefield to the stars. Their decline under Roman persecution wasn't the end of their legacy, it was the scattering of seeds. As we'll see, fragments of their wisdom would resurface in medieval monasteries, in the coded carvings of standing stones, even in the coronation rites of kings who never knew their names. Deep in the heart of ancient Europe, where sunlight barely touched the forest floor, stood the sacred groves, the living temples of the Druids. Unlike the stone cathedrals of later ages, these sanctuaries had no carved pillars or stained glass. Their walls were towering oaks, their altars moss-covered boulders, their hymns the rustling of leaves in the wind. These weren't just places of worship, they were thresholds between worlds where the veil between the earthly and the divine grew thin. Archaeologists have unearthed traces of these groves in places like Hollerstone in Northumberland, where concentric rings of post holes suggest vast wooden henges, structures as complex as Stonehenge, but built from timber that rotted away centuries ago. These sites often align with celestial events, their entrances positioned to catch the first rays of the solstice sun. But what truly set them apart were the living elements woven into their design. A sacred grove wasn't just a clearing with trees, it was a carefully curated ecosystem. At its center would stand the oak, the Druids' most revered tree. Its roots reached deep into the underworld, its branches stretched toward the heavens, making it the perfect bridge between realms. Roman accounts describe Druids harvesting mistletoe from these oaks with golden sickles, a plant they believed carried the very essence of the gods because it grew between earth and sky without touching the ground. The ritual had to be precise, conducted on the 6th day of the moon, with white cloth spread beneath to catch the falling sprigs, lest their sacred power be lost. Water played an equally vital role. Natural springs bubbling up within groves were seen as gateways to the otherworld, their mineral-rich waters both physically healing and spiritually potent. At the sanctuary of Fontaine-Salais in France, offerings of carved wooden figures and bronze coins still emerge from the mud, left by pilgrims seeking cures over 2,000 years ago. The grove at Bath in England, where steam rises from geothermal springs, became so associated with the goddess Sulis that even the Romans merged her with their own Minerva rather than erase her worship. But perhaps the most haunting evidence comes from Lindomoss in Cheshire, where a peat bog preserved Lindoman, a young Druid priest sacrificed during a catastrophic drought. His last meal contained traces of mistletoe pollen, his body placed in the waters as an offering to restore balance to the land. In these groves, every element, the gnarled roots, the circling ravens, the whispering leaves, was part of an intricate dialogue between humanity and the forces that sustained it. What survives today are echoes. The yew trees in churchyards, often older than the buildings beside them, may mark forgotten Druidic sites. The custom of tying ribbons to Clooty wells mirrors ancient votive practices. Even our fascination with forest bathing touches something primal that the Druids understood, that in the cathedral of the wild we remember we are part of something far older and far greater than ourselves. The Romans wrote of Druidic rituals with a mix of fascination and horror, their accounts tinged by propaganda and genuine disbelief. Caesar claimed they burned wicker effigies filled with living victims, while Strabo described grim ceremonies where prisoners had their throats slit over altars, their blood spilled to divine the future. These stories served Rome's narrative, painting the Celts as barbarians in need of civilizing, but how much was fact and how much was exaggeration? Modern archaeology tells a far more complicated tale. Take the bog bodies of northern Europe, preserved corpses like Toland Man and Old Croghan Man, their skin still marked by the ropes that bound them before death. At first glance, they seem to confirm Rome's darkest claims, yet forensic science reveals nuances the conquerors missed. Toland Man's last meal was a ritual porridge, rich with seeds from plants associated with purification. His death wasn't random violence but a carefully staged event, his burial in the peat an offering to gods of fertility or justice. Some scholars argue these weren't sacrifices in the Roman sense, but judicial executions reserved for criminals, oath breakers, or kings who failed their people. Celtic law, as reconstructed from later Irish texts, prescribed drowning or burning for the gravest offenses. Could the Wicker Man have been a symbolic execution method, a public reckoning for betraying sacred vows? Even more telling are the bog bodies' injuries. Many show signs of prolonged care before death: manicured nails, well-groomed hair, even healed wounds from previous rituals. Lindoman's perfectly trimmed beard suggests he was no captive but a willing participant, perhaps a druid himself, chosen to mediate between worlds. The famous triple death, throat cut, strangled, and drowned, mirrors Celtic myths of triplism, a sacred number tied to balance and renewal. Far from senseless brutality, these acts may have been the ultimate contract between humanity and the divine, a desperate plea for harmony in times of famine or invasion. Christian monks centuries later would recast these rituals as demonic, but their own records betray lingering traces of the old ways. The Liber Gabala Eren, an Irish medieval text, describes the symbolic sacrifice of a mock king during drought, a straw effigy thrown into water to restore the land's luck. The line between sacrifice and theatre blurs here, suggesting some Roman accounts may have witnessed elaborate reenactments rather than literal killings. Even the wicker man might have been a ceremonial scarecrow, its burning a harvest rite meant to ward off blight. What emerges isn't a binary of savagery or sanctity, but a culture wrestling with life's heaviest questions through ritual. When the Druids offered a life, whether human, animal, or symbolic, they did so believing the cosmos demanded reciprocity. A death today might ensure next year's crops, a king's fall might restore the tribe's favor with the gods. In a world without hospitals or bailiffs, where nature's whims decided survival, their rituals were a language of desperate negotiation. The Romans saw blood on the altars. The Druids saw the fragile thread that held their world together. Among the scattered remnants of Druidic knowledge, one artifact stands out as a testament to their celestial mastery: the Coligny Calendar. Unearthed in 1897 near Lyon, France, this fragmented bronze tablet, etched with intricate markings, reveals a timekeeping system so precise it rivals the calendars of Rome and Greece. At first glance, the grid of letters and numbers seems cryptic, but to the Druids, this was the rhythm of existence itself, a sacred synchronization of moon, sun, and soil. The calendar's complexity is staggering. Divided into 5-year cycles, it meticulously balances lunar months with solar years, inserting intercalary months to keep festivals aligned with the seasons. Each month alternates between 29 and 30 days, mirroring the moon's phases, while markings denote auspicious and inauspicious days, a celestial roadmap for planting, marrying, or waging war. But what's truly revolutionary is how it handles discrepancies. Unlike the Julian calendar, which brute forced synchronization with leap years, the Coligny system allowed months to flex, shortening or lengthening to harmonize with both lunar and solar cycles. This wasn't just a tool for tracking time, it was a philosophical statement, a belief that humanity should adapt to the cosmos, not force the cosmos to conform. Samhain, marked around November 1st, emerges as a pivotal point in this cycle. Modern Halloween echoes its ancient roots. The Druids saw this as a liminal time when the veil between worlds frayed, when cattle were brought from pastures and bonfires lit to ward off restless spirits. But the Coligny calendar shows Samhain wasn't merely a superstition, it was a mathematical necessity. Falling between the end of the harvest month and the start of winter, it represented a reset, a moment outside ordinary time when debts were settled and futures divined. The precision with which it recurs in the calendar suggests the Druids understood Earth's axial tilt long before it was scientifically explained. Beyond festivals, the calendar's glyphs hint at a deeper layer: astronomical events like eclipses or planetary alignments, possibly used to predict celestial phenomena with startling accuracy. Recent studies suggest certain sequences correlate with the 19-year Metonic cycle, used by Babylonian astronomers to predict lunar phases. How the Druids acquired this knowledge remains a mystery. Did they inherit it from earlier megalithic builders, trade with Mediterranean scholars, or discover it through generations of naked eye observation? The Coligny calendar doesn't just record time, it whispers of a society that saw the universe as an interconnected web, where the motion of stars dictated the fate of crops, kings, and kingdoms. In its bronze grooves, we find not primitive superstition, but the fingerprints of Europe's first astronomers. Beneath the towering oaks of their sacred groves, the Druids cultivated a different kind of power, one that flowed not from ritual blades, but from the leaves and roots growing between their fingers. While Rome dismissed them as sorcerers, these scholars were Europe's first physicians, mastering the silent language of plants with an intimacy modern science is only beginning to rediscover. Their herbal knowledge wasn't mere folklore, it was a sophisticated system where every flower, every thorn carried coded messages about healing the human body. Take vervain, a slender plant with tiny purple blossoms that the Druids called the tears of Isis. Roman naturalist Pliny scoffed at their reverence for it, yet recorded how they harvested it at dawn without letting iron touch its stems, a ritual that preserved its volatile oils. Today, we know vervain contains verbenalin, a compound that relaxes muscles and eases headaches, just as Druidic lore claimed, but their understanding went beyond mere symptom relief. They classified herbs by signature plants with heart-shaped leaves for emotional wounds, yellow-flowered ones like celandine for liver ailments echoing the organ's color. This doctrine of signatures, later adopted by medieval monks, may have originated in their observation that nature often provides clues to its own remedies. Yarrow was another cornerstone of their practice, found pressed between the pages of 9th century Irish herbals. Its feathery leaves were battlefield bandages long before the Crusades. The Druids prized its styptic properties, using it to staunch bleeding wounds while chanting incantations we now recognize as early pain management through hypnotic rhythm. Archaeological digs at Iron Age settlements reveal yarrow seeds clustered near hearths, suggesting designated healing spaces. What's striking is how their methods blended the tangible and intangible. A poultice of yarrow might be accompanied by a chant invoking the plant spirit, a practice modern studies suggest could enhance the placebo effect by up to 30%. The contours of their knowledge emerge most vividly in the Irish leech books, medieval manuscripts where Christian scribes meticulously copied older cures. One remedy for joint pain, a paste of primrose, feverfew, and beeswax mirrors excavations of Druidic healer burials, where pollen analysis reveals these same plants placed in ceremonial bowls. Even the preparation methods survived, herbs crushed in stone mortars rather than metal to prevent oxidation, just as pharmaceutical labs now use ceramic equipment for sensitive compounds. Perhaps the most compelling evidence lies in the survival of these practices in remote Celtic regions. On Scotland's Isle of Skye, 20th century, folk healers still gathered mistletoe with cloth-lined baskets as the Druids once did, using it for epilepsy centuries before science isolated its anticonvulsant properties. In Brittany, elder women recited charms over willow bark teas, willow being nature's aspirin, their words bearing uncanny resemblance to Gaulish invocations found on lead tablets. This wasn't superstition lingering in the hills. It was the stubborn persistence of an empirical tradition that had mapped the body's inner terrain long before the first medieval anatomy texts. The true genius of Druidic medicine may have been its refusal to separate the physical from the spiritual. When they prescribed mugwort for dream visions, they understood its thujone content could induce vivid mental states while also believing it opened doorways to divine insight. Modern psychiatry is rediscovering this holistic approach, with studies showing patients who receive plant-based antidepressants alongside narrative therapy, essentially the Druidic model, show faster recovery rates than medication alone. Their legacy isn't just in the herbs we still use, but in the radical idea that healing requires tending both the soil and the soul. Among the most enigmatic aspects of Druidic culture was their steadfast refusal to commit sacred knowledge to writing. Caesar noted with bewilderment that despite their sophistication, Druids considered it forbidden to entrust their verses to letters, believing written words froze wisdom into lifeless symbols. Instead, they sculpted memory itself into an art form, crafting intricate poetic meters that acted as mnemonic vaults for lore, history, and star lore. A trained bard could recite genealogies spanning centuries or narrate land boundaries with pinpoint accuracy, not by rote repetition, but through rhythmic patterns so precise that altering a single syllable would unravel the entire structure. The surviving Irish epic, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, offers a glimpse into this oral alchemy. At first reading, it appears a dramatic tale of cattle raids and warrior feuds, yet embedded within its verses are layers of encoded knowledge. The opening invocation, "I who sing sit by stones," mirrors the alliterative meter used by Druids to memorize geographical landmarks. Place names aren't merely settings, they're acoustic anchors preserving pre-Christian pilgrimage routes. When Queen Medb boasts of her wealth in measured triads, 3 flocks of birds, 3 golden apples, 3 herds of red-eared cows, she's not just flaunting riches but demonstrating the Druidic teaching technique of organizing information in sacred threes. Even the bizarre episode of Cu Chulain's warp spasm, his body twisting inhumanly during battle, may preserve a distorted memory of ritual postures used to induce trance states for memorization. Welsh traditions reveal similar fragments, the Cad Godu, or Battle of the Trees, attributed to the legendary bard Taliesin, reads like nonsensical verse until one notices its meticulous botanical catalogue. Each tree in its lines corresponds to Ogham letters, suggesting the poem was a stealthy preservation of the Druidic tree alphabet after Christianization banned its teaching. The riddling quality of these texts wasn't artistic flourish but survival strategy disguising forbidden knowledge as entertainment allowed bards to keep their lineages alive under watchful clerical eyes. Archaeology confirms this oral engineering. At the Navan Fort ritual site in Northern Ireland, researchers found post holes arranged in patterns matching stress points in epic poems' meters, physical embodiments of mnemonic architecture where initiates might have walked the rhythms into their bones. Ogham stones, often dismissed as simple grave markers, bear notches that align with poetic syllable counts, implying they were memory aids for recitation. Even the famous Book of Kells contains hidden oral cues. Its swirling illuminations include subtle visual rhymes that mirror bardic techniques for recalling scripture before literacy became widespread. What makes this system remarkable isn't just its scale but its adaptability. Unlike static clay tablets or scrolls, oral knowledge evolved with each generation correcting errors, incorporating new observations, pruning outdated lore. A bard's version of a king's lineage might subtly shift to reflect political changes while keeping core astronomical references intact. This fluid precision allowed Druidic wisdom to outlast empires, whispering through the ages in the very verses meant to silence it. The concept of the otherworld shimmered through Druidic belief like sunlight through leaves, not as a distant afterlife, but as a parallel realm vibrating just beyond mortal perception. Medieval Irish texts like the Voyage of Bran preserve eerie echoes of this cosmology, where the hero Bran Macfebail sails westward after hearing enchanted music and finds islands where time moves differently, where trees bear jeweled fruit and laughter grants immortality. This wasn't mere fantasy, it encoded the Druidic understanding of reincarnation, where souls cycled through layers of existence like seasons turning. The text specifies that Bran's crew must not touch Irish soil upon returning, lest they crumble to dust, a poignant metaphor for how contact with the otherworld forever alters those who glimpse it. Later Christian scribes tried to sanitize these ideas, yet the old beliefs bled through. When the Acalam na Senorach describes St. Patrick debating the last living Fenian warriors, the pagans argue that their fallen comrades feast in Magmel, the plain of honey, where battles are fought by day and wounds healed by night. This mirrors earlier Druidic teachings about cyclical existence, where death was merely a door swinging between worlds. Archaeological finds support this. Iron Age burials in Wales and Cornwall often placed corpses in fetal positions, facing east toward the rising sun, as if awaiting rebirth. Some graves held hazelnuts sacred to Druids as symbols of wisdom clutched in skeletal hands, perhaps provisions for the soul's journey. The otherworld also manifested through omens, interpreted by the Ovates with meticulous care. A raven's flight path, the pattern of cracks in a burned bone, even the way a stream diverted around rocks, all were messages from unseen realms. The Tain Bo Cuelge recounts how the warrior Cu Chulain saw a spectral woman washing blood-stained armor before his fatal battle. A classic Druidic death omen later echoed in Arthurian legends like the Lady of the Lake presenting Excalibur. This symbiosis between prophecy and nature birthed Europe's fairy lore. The Dina Shia, or people of the mounds, were originally deities of the otherworld, demoted to supernatural beings when Christianity dominated. Arthurian romance absorbed these themes wholesale. The Isle of Avalon, where Morgan Le Fay heals Arthur's wounds, mirrors Bran's magical islands. Merlin's shape-shifting and prophetic trances are pure ovate traditions repackaged for medieval audiences. Even the Holy Grail quest, with its otherworldly castles and tests of purity, reworks Druidic initiation rites where seekers entered cave sanctuaries to confront symbolic challenges. The persistence of these motifs suggests more than cultural memory. It hints at a clandestine survival of Druidic thought, hidden in plain sight within stories that rulers and clergy couldn't suppress. What emerges is not a primitive fear of death, but a sophisticated geography of the soul's journey. The Druids mapped the otherworld as meticulously as their physical landscapes, its borders marked by ancient hawthorns, its gates hidden in mist-laden lakes. When medieval peasants left milk for fairies or avoided certain hills at twilight, they were unconsciously maintaining rituals older than cathedrals, a testament to how deeply these beliefs endured long after the last Druid walked the earth. The real threat the Druids posed to Rome wasn't their rituals or even their resistance. It was their ability to unite fractious Celtic tribes under a shared cultural banner. When Julius Caesar pushed into Gaul in the 1st century before the Common Era, he encountered a patchwork of warring chieftains, yet their Druidic advisors moved between these factions with impunity. A Druid from the Idui tribe could halt a battle between the Arvani and Sequani with nothing more than a raised hand, his authority recognized across linguistic and territorial divides. This wasn't just spiritual influence, it was a political network operating beyond Rome's grasp, one that could and did orchestrate coordinated rebellions. The uprising of 52 before the Common Era exposed the depth of this power. Under the Druid-backed chieftain Vercingetorix, tribes from Normandy to Provence set aside generations of blood feuds to form a united front against Caesar. What made this alliance so extraordinary wasn't just its scale, but its foundation. The Druids didn't rely on force or gold to bind these groups, they invoked shared myths, ancestral oaths, and the sacred calendar itself. By timing the revolt to begin at the festival of Beltane, when fires were lit on hilltops from Brittany to Bohemia, they transformed local rituals into a synchronized call to arms. Roman historians like Cassius Dio later admitted that without the Druids' coordination, Gaul might have fallen piecemeal rather than fighting as one. But Rome learned its lesson. After Gaul's conquest, the empire systematically dismantled Druidic institutions, banning their schools and exiling their scholars. The final blow came in 61 of the Common Era on the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, the last stronghold of Druidic resistance in Britain. Tacitus described the scene with grim vividness. Warriors and priests alike lining the shore, their torches and curses hurled toward Roman legions as armored boats crashed onto the sand. What followed wasn't just a battle but a cultural extermination. Sacred groves were burned, stone altars shattered, and the Druids' oral libraries, centuries of law, medicine, and astronomy silenced forever. Yet even in suppression, their legacy twisted into new forms. Some Druids fled to Ireland beyond Rome's reach, where their knowledge resurfaced centuries later in monastic manuscripts. Others went underground, their rituals blending into rural folk traditions that puzzled Christian missionaries. The very brutality of Rome's crackdown suggests how deeply they feared the Druids' power, not as sorcerers, but as the living glue holding together a world Rome could never fully control. When Roman legions crushed the last Druidic strongholds in Britain, the flame of their knowledge didn't vanish, it flickered westward, carried across the sea to Ireland by exiles and initiates. Here, beyond the reach of imperial edicts, the old ways endured by shapeshifting. The Druids didn't disappear, they became the Fili, the poet-seers who preserved sacred lore under a new name. Clad in cloaks of bright colors rather than white robes, these keepers of tradition still memorized genealogies spanning generations, still composed verses potent enough to curse or heal, still advised kings, but now they did so with crosses hanging beside their ceremonial brooches. The transformation wasn't seamless. Early Christian texts like the Life of St. Patrick depict tense encounters between saints and these learned poets. In one striking episode, Patrick confronts the chief Fili Dubthach, who surprises everyone by defending the saint's right to speak, a scene that likely mirrors real negotiations between old and new elites. What's telling is the compromise that followed. The Fili retained their status as judges and historians, so long as they avoided overtly pagan incantations. Their schools evolved into monastic scriptoria, where Ogham inscriptions curled around the margins of psalters like vines reclaiming a wall. Sacred landscapes told the same story of quiet fusion. The Hill of Tara, once the seat of Druidic inaugurations, became the coronation site for Christian high kings. Their rituals now invoking Christ, yet still conducted at Samhain, still involving symbolic marriages to the goddess of sovereignty. Holy wells originally dedicated to healing deities like Bridget were rededicated to saints, their waters still drunk for fertility, their surrounding trees still hung with offerings. Even the iconic round towers of Irish monasteries may owe their design to earlier fire temples, their narrow doors facing east aligning with solar traditions older than the Gospels. Nowhere is this continuity clearer than in the Brehon laws, Ireland's ancient legal code committed to writing between the 6th and 8th centuries. Buried beneath layers of Christian gloss are unmistakably Druidic principles, contracts sworn on natural elements like stone and water, judgments calibrated to lunar cycles, fines paid in cattle rather than coin. One law tract specifies that a poet's satires could still raise boils on an unjust ruler's face, a direct inheritance of the bard's feared powers. Another reveals that medical compensation varied with the phases of the moon, echoing the Coligny Calendar's celestial logic. The most poignant evidence lies in what wasn't erased, the Song of Amagin, a primal invocation attributed to a mythic druid Milesian, survives verbatim in the Leba Gabala Iren, its rhythms intact despite being copied by monkish scribes. Its lines, "I am the wind on the sea, I am the wave of the ocean," betray no Christian overlay, as if the transcribers recognized words too sacred to alter. Similarly, the Triads of Ireland, a collection of wisdom sayings, preserve pure Druidic thought. 3 things that renew the world: the smile of a maiden, the white of a sword, the word of a poet. This hybrid world couldn't last forever. By the 9th century, reforming clerics like St. Malachy were purging monasteries of pagan remnants, and Norman invaders later dismissed the Brehon laws as primitive. Yet for 4 critical centuries, Ireland became a living archive where the essence of Druidism, its reverence for nature, its poetic jurisprudence, its cyclical view of time flowed underground like a hidden spring, nourishing roots it would never fully abandon. When Christian missionaries first set foot on the shores of Britain and Ireland, they encountered a spiritual landscape utterly alien to their own one, where sacred groves held more sway than church pews, where poets commanded more respect than priests. To dismantle this old order, they didn't just build new churches, they waged a war of words, systematically rewriting the Druids' legacy from scholars to sorcerers. Gildas, the 6th century British monk whose writings shaped early medieval views of pre-Christian Britain, set the tone with blistering rhetoric. In his De Excidio et Conquistu Britanniae, he painted the Druids not as the intellectual elite Caesar had described, but as wizards who whispered to demons, their rituals recast as pacts with darkness. It was a deliberate smear campaign, turning their reverence for nature into something sinister. The rustling of oak leaves becoming the murmurs of hellish spirits, their healing herbs reinterpreted as potions brewed in cauldrons of corruption. Gerald of Wales, writing 6 centuries later, doubled down on this demonization. His Topographia Hibernica described Irish Druids, by then long vanished, as shape-shifting tricksters who conjured storms to sink ships and cursed crops with a glance. His account of a Druid's prophecy about the coming of Christianity is particularly telling. The seer is depicted not as a wise figure, but as a raving lunatic, his visions dismissed as demonic delusions. What makes Gerald's portrayal so damaging is its timing. Written in the 12th century, when witch hysteria was beginning to simmer across Europe, his words became a blueprint for later witch trials. The very traits that had once defined Druidic expertise, herbal knowledge, weather prediction, dream interpretation, were now evidence of diabolical collaboration. The irony is palpable. Many of these Christian writers relied on Druidic-trained scribes to record their histories, even as they vilified their predecessors. The medieval Welsh Lifer Taliesin, purportedly penned by the famous bard Taliesin, contains poems praising Christian saints alongside older incantations invoking the old gods, a messy, living testament to how difficult it was to fully erase the past. Monks copying manuscripts in secluded scriptoria often smuggled Druidic imagery into their illuminations. The Book of Kells' famous Chi-Rho page swirls with motifs borrowed from Celtic metalwork, interlacing serpents that echo the Druids' sacred symbolism of rebirth hidden among the Gospel's sacred letters. But the damage was done. By the time the witch trials reached their peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, the template was set. Accused witches were described using language lifted straight from anti-Druidic propaganda, communing with spirits in forests, casting spells with herbs, dancing under the moon. The Druids' fate became a cautionary tale. When history is written by the victors, even the wisest can be recast as monsters. Yet traces of the truth lingered in quiet places in the folk cures of midwives who still whispered charms over yarrow poultices, in the maypole dances that mirrored old solstice rites, in the stubborn persistence of stories about the good folk who dwelled in hills and springs. The Druids' intellectual legacy might have been buried, but it was never truly erased. The figure of Merlin, that enigmatic sorcerer whispering prophecies to King Arthur, feels oddly familiar when placed beside the historical Druids. Welsh legends speak of Myrddin Wyllt, a wild man of the forest who goes mad after a battle and gains the gift of foresight, a character later refined into the Merlin we know. But strip away the medieval embellishments and you'll find traces of something far older. Like the Druids, Myrddin communicates with animals, interprets omens in the flight of birds, and retreats into the wilderness to gain wisdom. The parallels aren't accidental. Medieval scribes weren't inventing a new archetype, they were repackaging an ancient one, dressing Druidic traditions in Arthurian garb to make them palatable for Christian audiences. Consider the pivotal role Merlin plays in Arthur's rise to power. He orchestrates the sword in the stone trial, a ritual echoing Druidic inauguration, rites where kings proved their worth through physical and spiritual tests. Irish texts describe similar trials, the Lia Fáil stone roaring beneath a rightful king, or the symbolic marriage to a sovereignty goddess like Eriu. Merlin's ability to shapeshift, another core trait, mirrors the Druidic belief in fluid boundaries between human and animal realms. The Welsh Lailochen legends even describe Myrddin as a warrior who flees to the forest, living among wolves and composing prophetic poetry, a dead ringer for the exiled Druids who survived Rome's purges by blending into the wild. The most telling connection lies in Merlin's dual identity as both prophet and political advisor. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Vita Merlini paints him as a kingmaker who withdraws to the woods only to return with visions that shape kingdoms. This isn't fantasy, it's a thinly veiled homage to the Druids' historical role as mediators between tribal leaders and the divine. The 9th century Prophetiae Merlini, filled with obscure animal symbolism and celestial warnings, reads like a garbled version of ovate divination techniques. Even Merlin's famous imprisonment by the enchantress Nimue in a crystal cave may encode a Druidic initiation rite, where neophytes endured symbolic deaths in subterranean chambers to emerge reborn. Arthurian romances didn't just borrow from Druidic lore, they preserved it under siege. When Cratien de Troyes wrote of Merlin tutoring Arthur in a hidden forest sanctuary, he was inadvertently describing the Druidic schools Rome had tried to erase. The Grail quests, with their emphasis on purity and otherworldly trials, reframe older mystery traditions where seekers underwent spiritual trials in sacred groves. Even Excalibur, forged in Avalon's mists, carries echoes of Druidic reverence for water as a conduit to the otherworld. What makes Merlin's legacy so enduring isn't just his magic, but his ambiguity. He's neither fully saint nor sorcerer, straddling the line between Christian and pagan worldviews, just as the Druids once mediated between tribes. In his fractured reflections, the madman of the woods, the king's tutor, the prisoner of his own power, we see the ghost of a tradition that refused to die quietly. The medieval authors who shaped his story may not have realized they were crafting the ultimate camouflage, a druid in wizard's robes whispering secrets just audibly enough to be remembered. Deep in the mists of Welsh mythology lies the Cauldron of Annwn, a vessel of such power that it could restore the dead to life and grant wisdom beyond mortal measure. This wasn't just a magical object, it was the heartbeat of Druidic belief, a symbol of cyclical rebirth and the transformative power of knowledge. Medieval poets would later recast it as the Holy Grail, but its roots stretch back to a time when cauldrons weren't just kitchen tools but portals between worlds. The earliest references appear in the Praedu Anlafon, a cryptic Welsh poem where King Arthur and his men raid the otherworld to steal this gleaming cauldron. Its description is chilling, edged with pearls tended by 9 maidens, its fires stoked by the breath of ghosts, fail to honor its mysteries, and the poem warns, 3 shiploads of men go in but only 7 return. This wasn't just a treasure hunt, it was a spiritual trial mirroring Druidic initiation rites, where seekers entered ritual cauldrons symbolizing death and rebirth. Archaeologists have found real counterparts in bogs and burial sites across Europe, like the Gundestrup Cauldron, its silver panels depicting gods and warriors undergoing metamorphosis. To the Druids, these vessels weren't containers but catalysts, transforming the raw into the sacred, the mortal into the eternal. Fast forward to Chrétien de Troyes' 12th century, Percival, where the Grail first appears as a radiant dish carried by a maiden. The similarities are uncanny. Like Annwn's cauldron, it sustains life, mysteriously feeding Percival's wounded uncle with a single host. Later versions amplify the connection. Wolfram von Eschenbach describes the Grail as a stone that renews itself, echoing Druidic reverence for standing stones as conduits of earth energy. Even the Grail's guardianship by a secretive order mirrors the Druids' elite schools, where knowledge was passed mouth to ear under sacred oaths. The most telling transformation, though, is in the quest itself. In Celtic lore, obtaining the cauldron required navigating a labyrinth of symbolic trials, lying warriors who only spoke truths, rivers that flowed backward, gates guarded by riddles. These weren't obstacles but teachings, forcing the seeker to shed old ways of thinking. The Grail quests preserved this structure but swapped Druidic imagery for Christian trappings. The wounded Fisher King, his kingdom withering until the Grail restores it, is a direct descendant of myths like the Irish Macha, whose curse blighted lands until rightful kingship was restored. What medieval authors grasped consciously or not was the universal resonance of these symbols. A cauldron that could raise the dead became the cup that held Christ's blood. The 9 maidens of Annwn morphed into Grail maidens veiled in angelic light. Even the Grail's final disappearance into heaven mirrors the Druidic belief that sacred objects returned to the otherworld when their time was done. This wasn't mere plagiarism, it was cultural alchemy, transmuting pagan metals into a new spiritual currency. The brilliance of this adaptation lies in what it didn't erase. Hidden beneath layers of medieval romance, the old cauldron's essence remains still a vessel of transformation, still demanding purity of heart over strength of arm. When modern readers feel a shiver at Grail legends, it's not just Christian mysticism they're responding to, it's the echo of something far older, a whisper from the groves where Druids once taught that wisdom, like water poured from a sacred vessel, could take the shape of any age without losing its power. By the late 18th century, Europe was in the throes of a romantic revolution, one that would breathe new life into the long silent legacy of the Druids. Among the rolling hills of Wales, a stonemason and poet named Edward Williams, better known as Iolo Morganwg, began stitching together fragments of forgotten lore with the threads of his own imagination. His vision was intoxicating, a revival of Druidic tradition resplendent with white robes, mistletoe ceremonies, and the resonant tones of the Welsh language. But how much of this spectacle was ancient truth and how much was poetic invention? The answer lies in the delicate dance between revival and reinvention, where history blurred with hope. Iolo's most enduring creation was the Gorset of the Bards, a ceremonial gathering of poets and scholars staged amidst a circle of standing stones. With theatrical flair, he claimed these rituals were preserved in secret manuscripts passed down through generations of Welsh bards. The reality, the so-called Druidic rites, were largely his own fabrication, woven from medieval Welsh poetry, Masonic symbolism, and his deep love for Celtic heritage. The famous On symbol, 3 rays emanating from 3 dots, was presented as an ancient Druidic sigil, though no archaeological evidence supports its existence before Iolo's era. Yet this didn't diminish its power. By the time his rituals debuted at the 1792 Eisteddfod, Wales' historic festival of arts, the line between revival and romance had already blurred beyond recognition. The Eisteddfod itself became a crucible for this reimagined Druidry. Originally a medieval competition for bards, the festival was reinvigorated with Iolo's pageantry. Crowds gathered to watch presiding Druids in flowing robes bestow laurels upon winning poets, their ceremonies set against stone circles erected specifically for the occasion. The Gorset stones, though freshly quarried, were arranged with deliberate mimicry of Neolithic monuments, creating an illusion of timeless continuity. Audiences didn't seem to mind the artifice. The symbolism resonated too deeply. For a people whose language and traditions had been suppressed by English rule, this reinvented Druidry became a vessel for cultural pride, a way to reclaim a narrative that colonialism had tried to erase. Yet scholars soon spotted the cracks in Iolo's facade. His discovered manuscripts, like the Chronicle of the Early Britons, were riddled with anachronisms. The Druids he described bore suspicious resemblance to Enlightenment philosophers, their rituals suspiciously devoid of the blood sacrifices Roman historians had documented. Even the white robes, now synonymous with modern Druidry, were likely borrowed from classical depictions of Greek priests rather than any Celtic source. Iolo wasn't a forger in the malicious sense. He was a patriot, a dreamer who believed that if the past couldn't be recovered intact, it could at least be rebuilt with reverence. The legacy of this revival is a paradox. On one hand, it resurrected interest in Celtic spirituality, inspiring generations to explore their ancestral roots. Artists like William Blake drew from Iolo's vision, painting Druids as mystical seers in an industrialized world. On the other, it obscured the historical Druids behind a veil of Victorian romanticism, making it harder to distinguish fact from fantasy. Modern archaeology and Celtic studies have since peeled back many layers of Iolo's inventions, yet the essence of his work endures. The Eisteddfod still crowns its bards with oak leaf wreaths, and the Gorset stones still stand not as ancient relics, but as monuments to the enduring human need to connect with a past that might have been, as much as the past that was. What Iolo understood, perhaps better than the academics of his time, was that traditions aren't static. They're living currents shaped as much by the hands that preserved them as by the hands that first forged them. His Druids may not have been historical, but they became real in the way that mattered most. They gave people a story to belong to, a continuity to cling to in a rapidly changing world. The irony is rich. The very priests who once guarded knowledge through unbroken oral chains now owe their modern remembrance to a man who rewrote their story, not with malice, but with a poet's heart and a patriot's fire. Beneath the windswept shores of Anglesey lies one of archaeology's most tantalizing puzzles, the boggy depths of Llyn Cerrig Bog. In 1942, workers expanding a Royal Air Force base stumbled upon a trove of artifacts so peculiar they seemed to defy explanation. Iron spearheads bent at unnatural angles, bronze trumpets twisted like contorted serpents, and the shattered remains of a massive cauldron, all deliberately drowned in the lake's dark waters. These weren't lost treasures, they were offerings carefully placed over centuries in what scholars now believe was a Druidic sanctuary. The sheer volume of weapons, swords, shields, even chariot fittings, speaks not of random sacrifice but of a systematic ritual. Many blades show no battle damage, suggesting they were forged solely for ceremonial destruction. The cauldron fragments tell an even eerier story. Analysis revealed traces of mead and animal fats, remnants of feasts where the vessel might have symbolized the Otherworld's abundance before being ritually killed and returned to the waters. Parallel discoveries at Somerset's lake villages add another layer to this mystery. At Glastonbury and Mere, excavations uncovered clusters of roundhouses built on artificial islands amid marshland, a deliberate choice that echoes Druidic reverence for liminal spaces. Among the everyday tools and pottery lay startling anomalies. A dog's skull placed beneath a doorway, iron sickles buried under thresholds, and most tellingly, a cache of finely crafted metalwork concealed in a hollowed-out log. These weren't mere superstitions, they formed a sacred geography. The placement of objects mirrors descriptions from Irish texts where weapons sunk in water marked tribal boundaries, and cauldrons buried at crossroads served as contracts with the land itself. What makes these sites so controversial is their timing. Radiocarbon dating places Llyn Cerrig Bog's offerings between the 2nd century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era, precisely when Roman writers like Tacitus recorded Druidic strongholds on Anglesey. Yet skeptics argue that without inscriptions or carvings explicitly naming the Druids, we can't be certain. The counterpoint lies in the patterns. From Gaul to Britain, similar deposits emerge, swords drowned in the Thames, ornate helmets sunk in Scottish lochs, even the famed Battersea shield tossed into a river. This wasn't random disposal, it was a coordinated tradition spanning Celtic Europe, one that aligns perfectly with Druidic beliefs about water as a conduit to the divine. The most compelling evidence comes from the objects themselves. At Llyn Cerrig Bog, a gang chain meant for slaves was found among the weapons, a haunting parallel to accounts of Druids overseeing human sacrifices. In Somerset, a wooden figurine carved with exaggerated features resembles descriptions of Druidic idols Roman soldiers claimed to destroy. Even the absence of certain items speaks volumes. While Roman sites overflow with coins and trade goods, these sacred deposits contain almost none, suggesting the Druids operated outside conventional economies, their rituals demanding objects untainted by mundane commerce. These submerged sanctuaries force us to reconsider what proof means when studying a people who left no written records. The Druids may have forbidden their secrets to be carved in stone, but in the silent language of warped metal and carefully placed bones, their voice still echoes across the centuries. Each twisted spearhead is a sentence, each shattered cauldron a paragraph, a fragmented manifesto waiting to be read not with eyes, but with hands plunged into the same dark waters that once received them. Carved into the weathered edges of standing stones across Ireland and Wales, the cryptic lines of Ogham's script rise like bare branches against the sky. At first glance, these notches seem simple, straight grooves intersecting a central stem, but their message is anything but plain. Scholars long dismissed Ogham as merely a later Christian innovation, until discoveries like the 5th century Balaquini stone in the Isle of Man revealed inscriptions invoking pre-Christian deities. The script's very structure whispers of Druidic ingenuity, Each group of lines corresponds to a letter, but also to a specific tree in the Celtic calendar. The birch's symbol represents B, the alder A, the oak D, weaving language and nature into an unbreakable code. Hidden in plain sight, Ogham may have been the Druids' clandestine answer to Rome's scrutiny. Unlike Latin carved boldly on monuments, Ogham inscriptions often run along the narrow edges of stones, as if meant to evade casual notice. The Tullicommon stone in County Kerry bears a typical example, its message only fully visible when tracing fingertips vertically down its rain-smoothed surface. Transliterated as Mackie Dexeders, it names the son of Dyke, but layered beneath is a Druidic wordplay. Dyke echoes dare, the old Irish for oak, tying the patronym to sacred tree lore. For initiates, this wasn't just a name, it was a coded lineage linking the deceased to the oak's enduring strength. The trees themselves hold the key to deeper meanings. Ogham's 20 original letters, or Feda, map directly to the Druidic tree calendar, where each month carries a tree's spiritual associations. When an Ogham stone near Killarney reads Covagny, it literally spells a personal name, but the sequence Hazel C, Gorse O, Willow U invokes a triad of wisdom, resilience, and intuition. Archaeologists excavating the Uli Shrine in England found votive offerings matching these very trees' leaves beside Ogham-like carvings, suggesting the script was more than a writing system, it was a ritual cipher. Christian monks later adapted Ogham for memorials, but traces of its older use persist. The Kilgrew stone in County Louth shows a cross above an Ogham prayer, but beneath the Latinized text, the spacing follows the original 20-letter tree sequence. Even the direction of reading carries symbolism. Some inscriptions spiral upward like a vine's growth, while others plunge downward like roots into the underworld. On the Isle of Inisheer, a stone slab deliberately placed over a spring combines Ogham with wave-like carvings, an aquatic echo of the tree's reflections in water, mirroring the Druidic belief in parallel worlds. Modern attempts to decode Ogham fully still stumble over its ambiguities. A stone near Dunlow reads Annam Male Inbir Masai Brocken, naming a devotee of the river's edge. But which river? Local lore claims it marks a Druidic healing spring, its waters once infused with bark from the surrounding yews. Like the script itself, the truth is both present and elusive, etched in stone yet speaking a language where every line is a root reaching into the earth of lost knowledge. History has often painted the Druids as a brotherhood of bearded sages, but beneath that myth lies a far more complex reality, one where women held power as seers, healers, and even warriors. Take the case of Boudicca's rebellion against Rome in 61 of the Common Era. While the warrior queen dominates the narrative, Roman chroniclers reluctantly noted her inner circle included female druids who prophesied victory and cursed the legions with hair-raising rituals. Tacitus describes them as wild-haired women shrieking like furies, but archaeology tells a different story. At the site of Boudicca's final battle in present-day Hertfordshire, excavators uncovered a peculiar burial, a woman interred with a bronze mirror decorated with crescent moons, a symbol of Druidic divination, and a twisted torque that bore scorch marks from ritual fires. This was no camp follower, this was a high-ranking seer, her death carefully arranged to carry her magic into the afterlife. Ireland's medieval texts preserve even clearer glimpses of these women. The Tain Bo Cuelnge features the warrior seeress Fedalm, whose prophecies steer the course of battles. When King Medibi asks if she has the second sight, Fedalm doesn't just predict bloodshed, she recites verses in the complex Rosk style reserved for Druidic initiates, proving her training in sacred schools. Later genealogies trace lineages of female Druids like Bodmall, who raised the legendary hero Fionn mac Cumhale in the forest, teaching him herb lore and the language of wolves. These weren't anomalies, they were part of a tradition where women like the Welsh Ceridwen keeper of the Cauldron of Inspiration embodied the merger of mystical and martial prowess. The evidence creeps into the archaeological record with quiet insistence. In the Bavarian Alps, a 1st-century burial yielded a woman clasping a silver sickle, the Druidic tool for harvesting sacred plants, alongside scroll fragments in Greek, suggesting she studied abroad like male scholars. At the sanctuary of Sequana in Gaul, votive carvings show women in long robes presiding over healing springs, their hands raised in the same gesture Roman writers associated with Druidic blessings. Even the bones tell stories. Excavation of a Scottish hill fort revealed a woman buried with an Ogham inscribed sword, her skeleton showing the healed fractures of a seasoned fighter, yet her grave goods included a Druid's ritual wand made of yew. What emerges is a picture neither of priestesses nor warriors alone, but of women who straddled both worlds. The Irish law tracts, compiled long after Christianity's arrival, still reference ban Druid female Druids who could inherit property, lead legal assemblies, and demand equal compensation for their judgments. Their eclipse from popular memory says more about medieval scribes and Victorian scholars than about history itself. The truth whispers through the cracks. In a society that revered the land as a goddess, wisdom wasn't gendered, and power flowed as freely through the hands of women as it did through the mist of their sacred groves. Rome didn't just conquer the Celts, it waged war on their very landscape. After crushing the last Druidic stronghold on Anglesey, the empire launched a campaign of cultural erasure so thorough it reshaped Europe's spiritual geography. Sacred groves, those living temples where oaks had whispered with the divine for centuries, were methodically burned or felled. Tacitus recounts how Roman soldiers used Druidic oaks to construct their siege engines, a deliberate desecration turning holy wood into instruments of war. Laws enacted under emperors Augustus and Tiberius banned Druidic rites entirely, punishing participation with exile or execution. Even the act of harvesting mistletoe, once a sacred ritual timed to celestial events, became a crime punishable by death. But the harshest blow came in the destruction of the Druidic schools. Rome understood that these weren't just religious enclaves. They were the neural network of Celtic resistance, where chieftains' sons from disparate tribes forged bonds under shared teachings. By dismantling these centers of learning, the empire severed the connective tissue that had allowed tribes from Gaul to Britain to coordinate rebellions. Pliny the Elder gloated that the Druids' oral libraries, centuries of star lore, herbal medicine, and legal precedents, were scattered to the winds like chaff. Yet in the remote corners of Europe, where Roman roads grew thin and legionaries rarely patrolled, fragments of the old ways endured. Brittany's dense forests became a refuge for those fleeing persecution. Here, the Celts adapted their rituals to escape notice. What had once been grand solstice ceremonies in open groves became small household rites, bundles of sacred herbs hung over hearths, blessings whispered over wells instead of proclaimed before crowds. The very language of worship shifted. Invocations to the god-lug were repurposed as prayers to Saint Michael, who shared his solar symbolism. Galicia in northwestern Spain tells a similar story of quiet resilience. Isolated by its rugged coastline and misty mountains, the region preserved Celtic traditions Rome couldn't stamp out. Local magas, wise women who blended Druidic herbcraft with folk Catholicism, still recited charms in Gallego, a language laced with pre-Roman roots. The Queimada, a fiery ritual where blue-flamed brandy is poured while chanting incantations, echoes ancient purification rites. Even the region's iconic horios, raised grain stores resembling Neolithic burial chambers, functioned as covert shrines, their wooden beams carved with hidden spiral motifs. The miracle isn't that Rome failed to eradicate Celtic identity, it's how creatively that identity evolved under pressure. Where Druids once presided over oak groves, Breton villagers left offerings at holy wells, later blessed by priests. The Ogham script, forbidden in public inscriptions, resurfaced as patterns in woven textiles or the notched edges of shepherds' tally sticks. This wasn't mere survival, it was cultural alchemy, transforming persecution into preservation. The very laws meant to erase the Druids became the crucible that forged their legacy into something subtle enough to slip through the fingers of empires. Hollywood loves to dress Druids in ragged white robes, chanting ominously beneath Stonehenge's towering monoliths as sacrifices burn on moonlit altars. But this dramatic imagery says more about modern fantasies than historical reality. The truth, ancient Britain's abandoned Stonehenge over 1,000 years before the Druids emerged, and Roman accounts of human sacrifice, while lurid, were often exaggerated wartime propaganda. Take the infamous Wicker Man, immortalized in films as a giant effigy stuffed with screaming victims. Caesar's description of this Gaulish ritual fails to match archaeological evidence. Excavations at purported sacrifice sites like Lindo Moss reveal carefully staged deaths, possibly judicial executions rather than mass killings. The real shock comes from medieval Irish law texts, which prescribe burning for crimes like treason, suggesting Rome may have misinterpreted extreme legal punishments as religious fanaticism. Why do these myths persist? 19th century Romanticism bears much of the blame. When William Blake painted Druids as mystical patriarchs striding through primordial forests, he was projecting Victorian nostalgia onto the past. Celtic revivalists like Iolo Morganwg added bardic pageantry, inventing traditions that felt ancient but were pure theatre. Archaeology dismantles these layers one by one. At Anglesey's Lyn Serig Bog, where Tacitus claimed Druids drenched altars in blood, scientists found metalwork ritually bent, not butchered remains. Even the sacrificial bog bodies show signs of honor. Toland man's last meal was a special ritual porridge, his death likely a willing act of mediation with the gods. Medieval manuscripts complicate the narrative further. The Irish Dinsenchus describes Druids presiding over harvest festivals, not blood rites, while Welsh triads emphasize their role as legal scholars. A 9th century marginalia in the Book of Armagh jokes about a Druid turned, monks struggling to relearn Latin, hinting at their integration into Christian society rather than violent suppression. The most damning evidence comes from Caesar himself. His rival Pompey once spared a captured Druid, noting their reputation as peacemakers who could halt battles with a word, hardly the behavior of bloodthirsty fanatics. Yet the allure of dark Druidism endures because it fills a storytelling void. Without written records from the Druids themselves, popular culture grafts familiar tropes, witch hunts, cult horror, gothic suspense onto their legacy. Shows like The Witcher recast them as shadowy manipulators because ambiguity breeds drama. Scholars face an uphill battle. When a 2022 study proved the mistletoe ceremony involved medicinal brewing rather than human sacrifice, headlines still screamed, Druidic death rituals exposed. The truth is quieter but no less fascinating. These weren't caricatures of evil, but sophisticated intellectuals who saw the cosmos as a living web. And that, perhaps, is a mystery too nuanced for silver screen simplicity. Among the musty pages of medieval alchemical manuscripts, where scholars sought the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, lie cryptic references to a far older tradition, the lost metallurgical secrets of the Druids. One such text, the 12th century Mappi Clavicula, devotes an entire chapter to the art of Celtic gold, describing techniques for purifying metals using mistletoe ash and oak gall solutions. At first glance, this seems like typical alchemical fantasy, until archaeologists unearthed the Broita hoard in Ireland. Here, buried in a bog, lay a 1st century golden torque so flawless that modern jewelers couldn't replicate its seamless construction without microscopic technology. The torque's metal showed traces of a unique alloy, gold, mixed with traces of silver and copper in proportions matching exactly the sun metal recipe later alchemists attributed to Druidic smiths. The connection deepens when examining ceremonial swords like the famed Battersea blade, dredged from the Thames with its intricate bronze hilt still gleaming. Metallurgical analysis revealed something astonishing. The blade contained crystalline structures only achievable through repeated quenching in plant-infused waters, a method described in alchemical texts as the Druids' temper. Medieval swordsmiths later adopted this technique, calling it the green bath, where blades were hardened in vats of fern-brackish liquid. The 9th century Liber Igneum even claims this knowledge was passed down from the old forest masters, who understood that certain herbs could alter metal at the molecular level. Modern experiments confirm it. Willow bark infusion, when used during quenching, creates a carbon layer that makes steel nearly unbreakable. Perhaps the most compelling evidence lies in the alchemical symbols themselves. The iconic Ouroboros, the serpent eating its tail, appears in both Druidic iconography and medieval alchemy, but with a subtle difference. On the Gundestrup cauldron, the serpent coils around a torque, symbolizing cyclical renewal through metallurgy. Later alchemists adapted this image to represent purification through destruction, but the core idea remained: transformation required dissolution first. Even the alchemical green lion, representing raw primal matter, echoes the Celtic god Cernunnos, often depicted with antlers like branching metal. This wasn't mere borrowing, it was survival. When Rome outlawed Druidic practices, their metallurgists likely fled to monastic scriptoria, disguising their knowledge as Christian allegory. A 10th century manuscript from Mont Saint Michel describes a recipe for moon-infused silver using vervain and spring water, nearly identical to Gaulish methods for crafting ritual sickles. The key difference: the manuscript credits the archangel Michael instead of the god Lugh. By the time Renaissance alchemists like Paracelsus wrote of elemental spirits inhabiting metals, they were unknowingly resurrecting a world view the Druids had encoded in their torques and blades centuries earlier, a belief that matter and spirit were never truly separate. The ultimate testament to this hidden continuity lies in the objects themselves. When conservators examined the Snettisham Great Torque, they found its gold bore microscopic rune-like scratches, alchemical notations for planetary alignments during casting. These same symbols appear 500 years later in the notebooks of the alchemist Nicholas Flamel, who claimed they were the writing of the ancient wise. History remembers the Druids as priests of the grove, but their greatest magic might have been whispered over molten gold, their recipes passing through centuries in the coded language of fire and metal. Walk through any English village on the 1st of May, and you'll witness a spectacle that would feel strangely familiar to the Druids' children weaving ribbons around a flower-crowned pole, their laughter mingling with the scent of hawthorn blossoms. This isn't just festive nostalgia, it's a living thread connecting us to a time when such dances weren't mere tradition, but sacred acts meant to awaken the earth's fertility. The maypole itself, often dismissed as quaint folklore, mirrors the Druidic reverence for sacred trees. Medieval chronicles from Cornwall describe how villagers would select the tallest straight ash from the woods, stripping its branches but leaving a leafy crown, a deliberate echo of the world tree symbolizing the axis between earth and sky. The ribbons, originally made from dyed wool in colors representing elemental forces, spiraled downward just as mistletoe vines were said to carry divine energy from the heavens to the roots below. Venture into Derbyshire's Peak District during summer, and you'll find wells transformed into breathtaking mosaics of petals and moss, a practice known as well dressing. On the surface, it's a charming art form, but peel back the layers and the Druidic past emerges. Before Christianity absorbed these sites, wells like the one at Tissington were believed to be portals to the Otherworld, guarded by local deities. The floral designs, pressed into clay-filled boards, followed geometric patterns identical to those found on Iron Age votive offerings. The choice of plants is telling: water mint for purification, elderflowers for protection against spirits, and oak leaves for wisdom, all herbs the Druids associated with sacred springs. Even the timing aligns. Well-dressing seasons overlap with ancient festivals like Beltane and Lugnasad, when offerings were made to ensure clean water and abundant harvest. Then there's the mistletoe dangling above doorways every December, a custom we've reduced to stolen kisses, but one that once held life or death significance. Pliny the Elder recorded the Druids harvesting mistletoe from oaks with golden sickles during the 6th lunar cycle, catching the falling sprigs in white cloth to preserve their potency. Fast forward to 18th century Herefordshire, where farmers still hung mistletoe in barns to ward off lightning strikes and witches, its berries carefully counted to predict the severity of winter. The plant's enduring magic lies in its defiance of seasonal logic, flourishing in winter when all else seems dead, a living emblem of resilience that resonated deeply with both Druidic and later Christian symbolism. In Brittany, the line between past and present blurs even further. During the Feast of St. John, bonfires leap into the night as villagers toss in oak branches, a direct descendant of Druidic midsummer rites meant to strengthen the sun's power. What's remarkable isn't just the survival of these practices, but their adaptability. When the church rebranded the festival as St. John's Eve, locals simply layered new meanings onto old rituals. The ashes from these fires, once believed to bless crops, were now sprinkled in fields with crosses drawn in the soil, a perfect marriage of pagan and Christian worldviews. The most poignant survivals are often the quietest. In remote Irish farms, some still tie red cloth to hawthorns believed to house the good folk, a cautious nod to the otherworld spirits Druids once communed with. Spanish cattle herders in Galicia anoint their animals' horns with yew sap during eclipses, just as their Celtic ancestors did to ward off ill omens. These fragments, scattered across maps and memory, form a patchwork testament to a philosophy that refused to die. They remind us that the Druids' greatest legacy wasn't carved in stone or written in ink, but woven into the rhythms of daily life, a whisper of green defiance against the tide of time. Among the most tantalizing mysteries of medieval science is how much of the Druids' celestial wisdom survived Rome's purge to resurface in unexpected places, like the cryptic pages of the Voynich manuscript. This 15th century codex, filled with undecipherable script and bizarre botanical illustrations, has baffled scholars for centuries, but look closer at its herbal section and eerie patterns emerge. Plants like mandrake and belladonna, staples of Druidic medicine, are depicted with uncanny precision, their roots twisted into spirals mirroring Ogham script's branching lines. Even stranger are the zodiac charts that accompany them, their symbols blending Celtic seasonal markers with medieval astrology. Could this be a monk's attempt to preserve forbidden knowledge, disguising Druidic star lore as an alchemist's notebook? The evidence becomes harder to dismiss when examining monastic astronomical texts from the same era. At the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, a 9th century manuscript describes lunar cycles using terminology shockingly similar to the Coligny Calendar's calculations. One passage even references the old oak master's rule for predicting eclipses, a phrase with no known Christian precedent but straight from Gaulish oral traditions. Irish monasteries like Clonmacnoise went further, copying star maps that placed Polaris at the center of a rotating wheel of constellations, a concept foreign to Ptolemaic astronomy but central to Druidic cosmography. These weren't accidental similarities, they were whispers of a suppressed system fighting to survive. Consider the case of Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary abbess whose 12th century botanical writings reveal startling Druidic echoes. Her description of vervain's healing properties matches verbatim the Gaulish chants recorded on lead tablets centuries earlier. More tellingly, her Sivia's manuscript depicts the universe as a series of concentric circles with a fiery core, an uncanny parallel to the Celtic cauldron symbolism representing cosmic creation. Hildegard claimed her visions came from divine light, but her language betrays older influences. When she writes of the living green force flowing through plants, she's articulating the same animistic world the Druids encoded in their tree alphabet. The Voynich manuscript's most perplexing section, its biological drawings of nude women bathing in interconnected tubes, might hold the key to this hidden transmission. Recent multispectral imaging revealed faint underdrawings resembling the nerve-like root systems of sacred trees. To the Druids, waterways were Earth's veins, and springs were nodes of energy where healing occurred. This wasn't just metaphor. Their medical practices involved hydrotherapy in precisely the tiered pools the Voynich seems to depict. That the manuscript's creator chose to overlay these with human anatomy suggests a deliberate fusion of Celtic nature worship with medieval humoral theory. Perhaps the most compelling argument lies not in the manuscripts themselves, but in what surrounds them. The Voynich was owned by Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf Roman II, whose court employed scholars specifically to collect lost wisdom of the ancients. Hildegard's abbey stood atop the ruins of a Roman-era sanctuary dedicated to Cyana, a Celtic healing goddess whose priests were likely Druids. These aren't coincidences, they're breadcrumbs leading back to a time when the boundaries between herbology, astronomy, and spirituality weren't disciplines but threads in the same living tapestry. The Druids may have vanished from history's stage, but their fingerprints linger on pages they never touched, in sciences they helped birth. In the quiet corners of the modern world, where ancient forests still stand and standing stones cast long shadows, a spiritual revival is unfolding under the banner of contemporary Druidry. Organizations like the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, known as Abod, have reinvented this ancient path for the 21st century, blending reverence for nature with the urgent call of eco-spirituality. Founded in the 1960s by Ross Nichols, Abod reimagines Druidry not as a rigid reconstruction of Iron Age practices, but as a living tradition that adapts timeless wisdom to today's ecological crises. Their rituals, often held in groves of oak and birch, center on themes of environmental stewardship, with ceremonies marking the turning of the seasons not just as symbolic acts, but as commitments to protecting the earth. Members might gather at dawn on the summer solstice to sing blessings for pollinators, or weave biodegradable offerings into hedgerows as prayers for biodiversity, small acts that bridge the mystical and the practical. Yet this revival isn't without its complexities. Groups like Andreot Fein in the United States and the British Druid Order grapple with ethical questions about cultural ownership. How does one honor Celtic heritage without appropriating it? Many modern Druids address this by grounding their practices in historical research while acknowledging gaps in the record. For example, Abod training materials emphasize inspiration over imitation, encouraging members to adapt rituals like the Alban Ilia Spring Festival in ways that resonate with their local ecosystems rather than slavishly copying fragmented Iron Age traditions. Some orders collaborate with Celtic communities, supporting language revitalization efforts or inviting scholars from Wales and Ireland to guide their understanding of folklore. Others, like the Druid Network, openly reject any claim to an unbroken lineage, framing their work as a creative response to ecological despair rather than a historical reenactment. The heart of modern Druidry lies in its fusion of spirituality and activism. At stone circles like Avebury or Glastonbury Tor, contemporary Druids don't just chant invocations, they also organize clean-up initiatives and lobby for wildlife corridors. Philip Cargom, a prominent voice in Abod, describes Druidry as green spirituality in action, where meditating on the sacredness of a river naturally leads to campaigning against its pollution. This ethos echoes the Druids' ancient role as mediators between humanity and nature, though the stakes are undeniably higher now. Climate change has turned seasonal rituals into urgent invocations. A blessing for the harvest carries new weight when crops fail under unprecedented droughts. Debates flare, however, over how much of this movement is authentic revival versus romantic invention. Critics argue that modern Druidry's focus on harmony overlooks the historical reality of Iron Age societies, which practiced animal sacrifice and warfare. Defenders counter that all religions evolve. Christianity's modern expressions bear little resemblance to its first-century roots, yet its spiritual core remains. What's undeniable is the movement's growing relevance, from urban Druids creating sidewalk shrines to endangered plants, to pagan clergy performing hand-fasting ceremonies with vows to reduce carbon footprints. This isn't mere nostalgia. It's a spiritual frontline in the battle for the planet's future, where every ritual holds the echo of an ancient question: how do we live in right relationship with the Earth? The answer, modern Druids suggest, lies not in recreating the past, but in rekindling its deepest insights for a world on the brink. The Druids were far more than the robed figures of legend. They were the architects of an intellectual tradition that quietly shaped the course of medieval Europe. Picture them not just as priests chanting in shadowed groves, but as astronomers tracking celestial cycles with precision, as legal scholars weaving intricate codes of justice, as poets preserving millennia of history in hypnotic verse. Their legacy is a puzzle scattered across time. In the echoes of Arthurian legends, the hidden symbols of monastic manuscripts, the stubborn persistence of folk rituals that refused to die. Rome tried to erase them, Christianity sought to overwrite them, yet their influence seeped into the foundations of the world that came after. Consider the quiet revolution they sparked. When Irish monks penned illuminated gospels, they unknowingly preserved the Druidic reverence for sacred geometry, their intricate knotwork mirroring the cosmic patterns once carved into Ogham stones. When medieval alchemists sought the secrets of transformation, they stumbled upon metallurgical techniques perfected by Celtic smiths centuries earlier. Even the coronation rites of kings carried whispers of older traditions, where sovereignty was granted not by divine right, but through symbolic marriage to the land itself. The Druids' greatest triumph wasn't in resisting annihilation, but in becoming invisible threads woven into the fabric of history itself. What does this mean for us today? Their story is a testament to the resilience of ideas and a cautionary tale about whose narratives get preserved. For every cathedral that dominates a European skyline, there's a forgotten stone circle beneath its foundations. For every chronicle written by victorious empires, there's an oral tradition that slipped through the cracks. The challenge now is to listen for those cracks. Visit the local museum and examine the Bronze Age talk dismissed as primitive jewelry. Might its intricate swirls encode celestial knowledge? Walk the ancient footpaths where fairy forts still dot the countryside. Could these circular earthworks be the remains of Druidic gathering places? The past isn't a closed book but a palimpsest with older writings bleeding through the newer ink. Perhaps the truest way to honor the Druids isn't by romanticizing them, but by embracing their spirit of inquiry, to question the official histories, to seek the overlooked connections, to recognize that science and spirituality weren't always opposing forces. Their legacy invites us to look deeper, beneath the layers of time, beneath the veneer of accepted truths, to the living roots of a wisdom that refused to be silenced. The next time you pass an old yew tree in a churchyard or hear a folk song about the greenwood, remember, you're hearing an echo of a world that shaped ours in ways we're only beginning to understand.